in the rolling hills of Virginia, where the trees sway quietly in the wind and life seems to move at a gentler pace. There once walked a young man whose story remains largely unknown to the world. He never became famous, he never led armies, he never built great monuments, nor did he live to see the full bloom of adulthood. And yet, his name continues to echo through the halls of faith, whispered among those who believe that holiness can burn brightly, even in the briefest of lives. His name was Francis Joseph Parater. To his friends, simply Frank. He was not destined to live long by the world's standards, but in the eyes of God, his short journey carried a weight that could not be measured in years. Born in 1897 in Richmond, Virginia, Frank was the eldest of 7 children in a deeply Catholic family at a time when Catholics were a minority in the American South. His upbringing was simple, his surroundings humble. Yet within him burned a desire that would set him apart, a longing to give his whole self to God. This is not the story of a man who lived decades in the spotlight of the church. This is the story of a young seminarian who died at the age of 22. But before his death, he left behind something so powerful, so prophetic, that even today it moves souls to conversion and inspires young people to believe that holiness is not reserved for the old or the extraordinary. It is within reach of anyone who dares to surrender completely to love. Frank's life reads like a brief candle lit with joy, burning with devotion, and extinguished too soon in the eyes of those who loved him. But like all holy lives, the flame did not die, it spread. His final words, hidden in a letter never meant to be seen during his lifetime, became a beacon of faith for generations. And so we ask, how can a life so short, a story so simple, hold such power? What can a 22-year-old seminarian, who never even became a priest, teach us about faith, sacrifice, and the meaning of our own lives? This is the story of servant of God Francis Joseph Parater, the young American whose path to sainthood continues to inspire more than a century after his death. Frank Parater was born on October 10, 1897, in Richmond, Virginia, the first child of Anthony and Mary Parater. To be the eldest of 7 children was no small role, especially in a Catholic family where faith, discipline, and responsibility wove through daily life like threads in a sturdy garment. From the very beginning, Frank carried that role with quiet strength and joy. He learned early that his life was not his own, that it belonged to God and to those he loved. At the turn of the century, Richmond was a city of contrasts. Its Civil War scars still lingered, and its Catholic population remained small, often misunderstood or looked upon with suspicion in the largely Protestant South. To grow up Catholic in such an environment required courage. Families like the Paraters had to live their faith with quiet determination, attending Mass faithfully, praying together at home, and holding on to traditions that reminded them they belonged to something larger, the universal church. In this setting, young Frank's character began to shine. He was not the type to draw attention to himself with loudness or pride, but those who knew him remembered his steady presence. His siblings looked up to him, his parents relied on him, and his community respected him. As a boy, he quickly grew fond of the outdoors. He loved the hills and rivers of Virginia, the simple adventures of scouting, and the quiet lessons of nature. He joined the Boy Scouts of America, still a relatively new movement at the time, and thrived there. His natural leadership and trustworthiness stood out so clearly that he rose to the rank of Eagle Scout, a distinction that even then carried weight and respect. His friends admired him for being dependable, joyful, and always ready to lend a hand. But beneath his cheerful demeanor ran something deeper, a strong current of faith. From childhood, Frank served at the altar during Mass. The silence of the sanctuary, the flicker of candles, the rhythm of prayers, they imprinted themselves on his soul. He was not content to simply be Catholic in name. His heart longed for more. His friends noticed it too. They would later recall that even as a teenager, there was something different about him. A seriousness about life, a desire to give rather than to take, and a sense of purpose that seemed to guide his every step. It is easy to imagine Frank walking home from church in his scout uniform, a prayer book tucked under one arm, a smile on his face. To those around him, he was simply a good son, a good friend, a good leader. But within, he already felt the stirrings of something greater. By the time he reached high school, Frank's path was becoming clear. He was not chasing wealth or recognition. He was not drawn by the promises of worldly success. Instead, he felt a calling, a quiet but insistent voice pulling him toward the priesthood. And while others his age might have dismissed such a thought as too heavy, too serious for a young man, Frank welcomed it with open arms. He wanted nothing more than to serve God fully and completely. For him, faith was not an accessory to life, it was the very heart of it. As Frank grew into his teenage years, the qualities that had quietly marked him as a boy began to shine more brightly. He was cheerful, yes, but his joy was never shallow. It came from a steady peace, a sense that life had meaning and direction. His friends remembered him as dependable and trustworthy, someone who could be counted on whether in simple daily tasks or in moments of challenge. The Boy Scouts of America became a stage where Frank's natural gifts unfolded. In those early decades of scouting, when the movement was still fresh and full of energy, young men were being trained not only in outdoor skills, but in discipline, leadership, and character. Frank excelled in all of it. He learned to pitch tents under the stars, cook over open fires, and guide younger boys through rugged trails. He was not just a participant. He became a leader, eventually earning the prestigious rank of Eagle Scout. For Frank, scouting wasn't just about badges or recognition. It was another way to live his faith. The Scout oath and law, with their emphasis on duty to God, service to others, and living with honor, fit perfectly with his personal convictions. His companions would later say that he embodied the Scout's code, even when no one was watching. He treated others with respect, reached out to those who were overlooked, and carried himself with humility. It was during these years that Frank's holiness began to show in ways that could not be hidden. He had a way of making people feel seen, valued, and encouraged. If someone was struggling, Frank would quietly step in to help. If a younger scout lost confidence on a hike, Frank would walk alongside him until he found his courage again. He was not dramatic about it, nor did he seek praise. Kindness was simply his way of being. But there was also something deeper that his friends noticed. Frank's faith was not confined to Sunday Mass or family prayers. It was woven into everything he did. He prayed often, not in a showy way, but with the naturalness of someone who knew God was near. His devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which would later become central in his act of oblation, was already quietly shaping him. Even as a teenager, Frank's love for God was obvious. He was the type of young man who could be playful and lighthearted, yet at the same time serious about his spiritual life. His joy and his devotion were not in conflict, they flowed together. To his friends, he was proof that faith did not make someone gloomy or distant. It made them more fully alive. In many ways, Frank represented the possibility of youthful holiness that the Church would later highlight in figures like Saint Thérèse of Lisieux or Blessed Carlo Acutis. Like them, he showed that sanctity was not about age, but about love. By the time Frank finished high school, it was clear to those around him that he was not meant for an ordinary path. He had already begun to discern more seriously the call to priesthood. His dream was simple yet profound: to serve God completely and to dedicate his life to the Catholic Church in Virginia, which was still small and in need of faithful shepherds. The boy who once led scouts through forests and rivers was now preparing to lead souls toward Christ. His path was set, though neither he nor those around him could have imagined just how brief and how powerful that journey would be. By the time Frank Parater completed high school, his sense of direction in life was undeniable. While many of his classmates looked ahead to careers in business, farming, or trade, Frank's heart was set firmly on the service of God. He had known for years that the priesthood was not simply an option, it was his calling. In the early 20th century, the Catholic Church in Virginia was still small and scattered. Catholics made up only a fraction of the population, and priests were few. For a young man like Frank, who loved both his faith and his people, the need was clear. He longed to be a shepherd for those who had so few. He began his formal studies at Belmont Abbey College in North Carolina, a Benedictine institution where faith and learning were deeply united. There, Frank immersed himself not only in academic life, but also in the rhythm of prayer and community. He was known as a diligent student, serious about his studies, but never distant or unapproachable. His classmates respected him, not because he tried to impress them, but because he lived with authenticity. Belmont Abbey also gave Frank an environment to deepen his spiritual life. Surrounded by monks and seminarians, he found himself in an atmosphere where prayer punctuated each day and the pursuit of holiness was woven into ordinary routines. He absorbed this life eagerly, shaping himself into the kind of man who could guide others toward God. From Belmont, Frank advanced to the seminary for the Diocese of Richmond. It was here that his dream sharpened into focus. He wanted to return to Virginia, where Catholicism was still young and often misunderstood, and give his life as a priest to nurture the faith of his people. He saw his vocation not as a career, but as a total offering a chance to pour out every part of himself in service to Christ and his church. Frank's letters from this period reveal his growing maturity. He wrote with a tone of quiet conviction, describing his joy at being called to such a path. He was not naive about the challenges. He knew the priesthood required sacrifice, self-denial, and an unshakable love for God. Yet he embraced it all. To him, the weight of the cross was not something to fear, but something to carry gladly. In 1919, a decision was made that would alter the course of Frank's life forever. Recognizing his promise and devotion, his superiors sent him to Rome to continue his formation at the Pontifical North American College. For any seminarian, this was a great honor. It meant not only advanced studies at the heart of the church, but also preparation to return as a leader, equipped to strengthen the Catholic presence back home. Frank accepted the assignment with humility. He was eager to learn, eager to grow, eager to dedicate every part of himself to God's plan. He boarded the ship that would take him across the Atlantic, carrying with him the hopes of his family, his diocese, and his own quiet determination to serve. What he could not know was that this journey to Rome, meant to prepare him for decades of priestly ministry, would instead become the final chapter of his short but radiant life. When Frank arrived in Rome in 1919, he stepped into the very heart of Catholicism. The Eternal City, with its ancient basilicas, cobblestone streets, and echoes of saints and martyrs, had been a place of pilgrimage and study for generations. For a young man from Richmond, Virginia, it must have felt overwhelming yet also profoundly right. He took up residence at the Pontifical North American College, where seminarians from across the United States gathered to prepare for priesthood. The days there were filled with prayer, study, and community life. Mornings began with Mass, followed by hours of theology and philosophy lectures. Afternoons brought personal study and spiritual direction, while evenings often ended in quiet reflection or discussion with fellow seminarians. Frank adapted to this life with ease, not because it was comfortable, but because it aligned perfectly with the rhythm of his heart. His companions noticed something remarkable about him. He was not the loudest in conversation, nor did he seek to stand out. But there was a quiet radiance about him, an interior joy that seemed to spill over into everything he did. He was deeply devoted to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, a devotion that had already marked his teenage years, but now matured into something more profound. While others sometimes approached devotion as a duty, Frank approached it as a love story. For him, the Sacred Heart was not an abstract image. It was the living symbol of Christ's total, burning love for humanity. To unite himself to that heart became his consuming desire. In conversations, his humility stood out. He did not boast of his achievements, though they were many. He was quick to listen, slow to speak, and always generous in his encouragement. For a young seminarian, he already carried the demeanor of a seasoned priest. But beneath this serene exterior, Frank was also wrestling with something deeper. Away from home, far from Virginia, he was acutely aware of the fragility of life. Perhaps it was the war still fresh in Europe's memory. World War I had ended only the year before. Perhaps it was the sense that his own health was never as strong as others. Whatever the reason, Frank began to contemplate what it would mean to offer everything, not just his priesthood, but his very life to God. During these months, he quietly composed what would later be known as his act of oblation to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. In it, he did something extraordinary. He offered his life and even his death for the salvation of souls, particularly for the conversion of non-Catholics in Virginia. It was a radical prayer, hidden in the folds of his spiritual notebook, never intended for public eyes. It was the kind of act that saints make, an act of complete self-surrender, a willingness to let God use one's life in any way he sees fit. At the time, no one else knew about it. To Frank, it was simply a private love letter to Christ, a secret covenant of trust. Yet, as history would reveal, this quiet act would become the defining moment of his entire legacy. Among the papers Frank left behind in Rome was a letter, folded neatly, tucked away, and written in his own careful hand. It was not addressed to anyone. It was not meant for publication. It was a private offering, a covenant between one young man and God himself. This was his act of oblation to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. When we read it today, we encounter not the words of a seasoned mystic or an old priest who had lived decades of ministry, but the voice of a 22-year-old seminarian. And yet the depth of faith, the clarity of vision, and the totality of surrender in these pages can only be described as extraordinary. Frank began by acknowledging the gift of life and his desire to make it count, not in worldly terms, but in eternal ones. He wrote, "I shall be more of service to my diocese in heaven than I could ever be on earth." With this single line, he reframed the meaning of vocation. Priesthood was his goal, but even if God chose to call him before ordination, he believed his mission would not end. It would only change form. In heaven, united with Christ, he believed he could do even greater work for the salvation of souls. Frank's oblation was not abstract. It was precise. He offered himself for a specific purpose, the conversion of non-Catholics in Virginia. He loved his homeland, with its scattered Catholic communities surrounded by misunderstanding and sometimes suspicion. His dream was to bring the light of faith to those who did not yet know Christ in his fullness. If his life on earth could not do it, then his life in heaven, he prayed, would. He continued with words that still strike the heart with their boldness. "I offer my life for the salvation of souls and for the good of the Church. I give myself entirely to the Sacred Heart of Jesus." This was not poetry. This was not pious exaggeration. This was a deliberate surrender, a young man placing every hope, every dream, every heartbeat at the feet of his Savior. Imagine the scene. Rome in 1919. The war has ended, but its wounds are still fresh. A young seminarian, far from home, sits quietly in his room. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica toll across the city. Inside, he bends over his desk, writing words that he never intends anyone to see. He is not seeking recognition. He is not crafting a speech. He is simply giving God everything. For most people, such a letter might have been forgotten, buried in a notebook, lost with time. But for Frank, these words would soon take on prophetic weight. For within a year of writing them, his offering would be tested in a way no one expected. This act of oblation is what makes Frank Parater's story so unique. Many saints wrote profound reflections later in life, after years of experience. Frank, at only 22, spoke with the same clarity and courage. His letter revealed not only the depth of his faith, but also his readiness to accept whatever God might will, even if that meant an early death. And that, tragically yet beautifully, is exactly what happened. The hidden letter, discovered only after his passing, would travel far beyond Rome. It would cross oceans, appear in newspapers, and stir hearts across the United States. The words of a young man, unknown outside of his small circle, would become a testament to what it means to truly belong to Christ. In this single act of surrender, Frank gave us his legacy, a reminder that holiness is not about length of life, but about the depth of love. Not long after he penned his act of oblation, Frank's life took a sudden and dramatic turn. In late 1919, while still in Rome, he fell gravely ill. What seemed at first like a passing sickness quickly revealed itself to be rheumatic fever, a disease that, at the time, often proved fatal. For a young man who had traveled across the ocean to prepare for a lifetime of priestly ministry, the diagnosis must have been devastating. Yet those who were with him recalled not despair, not fear, but a serenity that seemed beyond natural explanation. Frank accepted his suffering with patience and a profound sense of peace. He did not rage against his fate, nor did he collapse in self-pity. Instead, he united his pain to Christ's own suffering, seeing in it another way to love and to serve. As his body grew weaker, his spirit only grew stronger. His fellow seminarians visited him, and they were struck by his calmness. Even in the face of death, Frank radiated a quiet joy. He spoke not of regret, but of trust. He was only 22 years old, yet he carried himself with the composure of a soul who had already glimpsed eternity. On February 7, 1920, Frank Parater passed peacefully into eternal life. He never returned to Virginia, never preached a homily, never raised the chalice as a priest. From a worldly perspective, his story might have looked like a tragedy, an unfinished life, a vocation cut short. But God had written a different ending. After his death, his belongings were gathered, and among them, his brother seminarians discovered the hidden letter, his act of oblation to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. When they read it, they were stunned. Here was the explanation for his serenity, the key to his peace in suffering. Frank had already given everything to God: his future, his death, his very self. He had offered it all in love. The letter was sent back to his diocese in Richmond. Once published, it spread like wildfire, appearing in Catholic publications across the United States. Ordinary Catholics read it and felt their hearts burn with renewed faith. Young people saw in Frank a model of holiness that was not out of reach. Priests and seminarians were moved by his courage and devotion. Families found inspiration in his total surrender to God's will. His words, written in the quiet of a Roman seminary room, now echoed across a continent. Frank's death might have closed one chapter, but it opened another: his legacy. In the years that followed, his story continued to inspire. His life became proof that holiness is not measured by age, status, or length of ministry, but by the depth of love one pours into every moment. In 2001, the Diocese of Richmond officially opened his cause for canonization. This gave him the title Servant of God Francis Joseph Parater. His writings, his life, and the testimonies of those who knew him were studied carefully, with Rome recognizing that this young Virginian seminarian had indeed lived with heroic virtue. For now, his cause remains open, awaiting the recognition of a miracle attributed to his intercession. The Church requires such miracles as signs of God's confirmation of sanctity. While none has yet been formally approved, many faithful continue to pray for his intercession, trusting that the day will come when his holiness will be confirmed by heaven itself. But even without a recognized miracle, many argue that Frank's life itself is a kind of miracle. In a world that often measures success by power, wealth, or longevity, his story flips the script. Here was a man who had nothing to offer by worldly standards, no career, no fortune, no long list of accomplishments. And yet, by offering his very self, he touched countless lives. He is remembered today as a model for young people, showing that you do not need to wait until old age to pursue holiness. Sanctity can begin now, in youth, in simplicity, in trust. Picture again the quiet hills of Virginia where Frank once walked as a boy. Imagine the young scout, smiling as he led others through forests and rivers. Picture the seminarian, kneeling in prayer in the grandeur of Rome, his heart burning with love for Christ. And then, picture the young man on his sickbed, serene and radiant, ready to meet his Lord. From beginning to end, his life was short, but it was full of love, full of faith, full of surrender. When we hear his words today, "I shall be more of service to my diocese in heaven than I could ever be on earth," we realize that they were not just the idealistic dream of a young seminarian. They were prophetic. Over a century later, his words continue to bear fruit. Souls are still moved. Faith is still strengthened. And countless young people are still discovering through his example that holiness is not out of reach. Francis Joseph Parater never became a priest on earth. But perhaps, as he predicted, he has become a priest in a higher sense in heaven, offering intercession for the people he loved. His life asks us difficult but necessary questions. What are we living for? How much of ourselves are we willing to surrender? Do we measure life by years or by love? The Church continues to walk slowly with his cause for canonization, and one day we may see him declared blessed and then saint. But titles aside, Frank's witness already speaks with the voice of sanctity. He is a reminder that life is not ours to control, but ours to give. A reminder that holiness can bloom in the young, the ordinary, the overlooked. And above all, a reminder that love, true, sacrificial, Christ-centered love never dies. So as we close this story, we echo the prayer of those who knew him and those who have come to know him since. Servant of God Francis Joseph Parater, pray for us.